Alright, so our last video for this week looks at the international monetary system, which as you can see refers to the institutional arrangements that countries adopt when they attempt to govern exchange rates. So this is clearly quite an important framework, given all the previous the stuff that we've talked about in the previous videos this week. On a global scale, it tends to be governed by two key multinational institutions, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank, and we're going to go through both of them today, but in particular we're going to focus on the IMF given its significance in the international monetary system. Now both the IMF and the World Bank were actually set up in 1944, right at the middle, well not the middle, but the height basically, of World War II, when we had representatives from 44 different countries coming together to try and put a stop to a series of financial struggles which had occurred in the preceding decade. So the overall tasks of these two organisations, the IMF was set up to maintain order in the international monetary system, so to police this, and the World Bank was supposed to promote general economic development, so they were complementary in that sense. Focusing, as I say, in particular on the IMF, the main reasons why it was set up was to help combat, first of all, the worldwide financial collapse. There'd been the Great Depression in the 1930s, which had hit a lot of countries, in fact all countries around the world really hard, and so by the 40s a lot of governments wanted to avoid that from happening again. There'd been a series of competitive devaluations, especially after World War I, where effectively the governments, to try and increase the viability of their economies, had boosted exports by deliberately devaluing the value of their own currencies to make those exports more attractive and to try and boost their overall economy. Now that was okay, but it did stimulate as much, amongst other things, inflation and even hyperinflation, and led to a situation where it was just basically a trade war between the different nations trying to reduce the value of their own currency, which meant that each of those units of currency were effectively worthless in a lot of situations. These trade wars were going on, the hyperinflation that we'd spoken about in Germany and many other countries around the world, and just a general economic disintegration, effectively, that we'd seen between this period in between the two world wars. So when it was originally set up, the IMF's original function, as I say, was to provide effectively a pool of money, and we're not talking about this pool of money. It's like a big bank, effectively, from which members who were committed to the IMF could borrow short-term loans, mainly to adjust their balance of payments position. So if they were in, for example, a position of consistent balance of payments deficit, they could be loaned money to try and adjust that, and also to maintain fixed exchange rates, which were very much part or sort of in vogue at the time that the IMF was established. So being able to have the monetary means to help maintain that set level of the currency was quite important. Today, though, a lot has changed. Certainly the fixed exchange rate is not so much in vogue. As we've mentioned in the previous videos, most countries now have moved towards a floating exchange rate, and there isn't such a concern over the need to adjust trade deficits in that situation, because the system in theory should work itself out without the need for these short-term loans. So the IMF has basically had to adjust its role, and today we tend to see it focusing on lending money to countries in financial crisis. And there are three types of financial crises in particular where the IMF tends to step in today. And they are a currency crisis, a banking crisis, or a foreign debt crisis. And we're going to go through each of these in turn. A currency crisis, first of all, is when there is a speculative attack on an exchange value of a currency that typically results in a sharp depreciation in the value of that currency. So, as we've mentioned in previous slides, you get a situation where people are expecting or worried about a depreciation in the value of a particular currency, and so they start selling that and trying to shift their funds into another currency, which of course, as we said, leads to a significant depreciation in its value. And in some instances actually forces the authorities to expend significant volumes of international currency reserves and sharply increase interest rates in order to defend those prevailing the previous exchange rates. And this absolutely happened in Brazil in the early 2000s, where basically the IMF had to actually step in to help stabilize the value of the Brazilian currency on the foreign exchange markets by lending it foreign currency. There had been a huge speculative attack and concern that there would be a devaluation in the Brazilian currency, the real, and so investors and companies took all their money out of the Brazilian economy and tried to move it into a different currency which it perceived as being of greater value or wouldn't suffer the same fate and depreciation of this, that was speculated in relation to the real in Brazil, which meant that you had all this money going out of the economy, which of course did cause a devaluation in the actual currency's value. And that's why the IMF stepped in and loaned money to ensure that there was still some money getting into the country and help them through that crisis there. A second type of crisis is a banking crisis, and anyone who has seen the movie The Big Short will understand what we're talking about here. It refers to a situation in which there is a loss of confidence in the banking system, which in turn leads to a run on the banks where people withdraw all their money and deposits from those banks and often sees the collapse of the banking sector in that particular economy. And that's exactly what happened in The Big Short. That's what contributed to the global financial crisis that we all know about today. And this is what happened in Iceland in the late 2000s, around 2008 or so. And again, the IMF stepped in there with loans to help stabilise that particular industry in Iceland. The third type of crisis is a foreign debt crisis, and this is a situation where a country cannot service its own foreign debt obligations, be they private sector or government levels of debt, but they find themselves in a huge situation there where they just cannot meet those repayments. And this has happened in a number of European countries in the last decade or so. Countries like Greece and Ireland and Spain have had significant problems with their foreign debt. There was a well-publicised episode of Top Gear a few years ago where they were able to buy out an entire airport in Spain. Such was the dire financial situation in that particular country. So again, the IMF looked to step in here and resolve that issue around a lot of the European countries in the early 2000s. Has the IMF been successful in achieving all these stated objectives? There has been a number of concerns in terms of the actual effectiveness of this organisation. Most of these concerns actually revolve around basically the set of rules that the IMF puts in place if you want to apply as a country to receive one of their short-term loans. They basically have a list of expectations and requirements that you need to meet and tick off if you are to be granted one of those loans. Now, this has some issues, and a lot of people have said that these types of policies are actually not entirely appropriate. They argue that this one-size-fits-all approach to macroeconomic policy in terms of the things that you as a country need to be achieving in order to be granted one of these loans is actually inappropriate for many countries. Sometimes, as our feline friend here demonstrates, it just doesn't fit with the specific set of requirements that you're looking at. So, for example, a lot of the time critics of the IMF will argue that they'll impose all these conditions in order for the country to be granted a short-term loan, and it's very much in line with an economic rationalist agenda, basically cutting public spending, imposing high interest rates, having tighter monetary control, and so on. But a lot of the time, critics argue that it's not actually the government who's at fault. It's often the private sector who have, for example, high levels of debt, which is leading to these crises. So to simply impose all these rules and say that every country must abide by them if they are to be granted these short-term loans and to fix up the governmental monetary control, it doesn't quite work that well, certainly for some countries. There's also concerns from a moral perspective here. Certainly some critics argue that if you basically set up a system as has been established with the IMF, where if you as a government do fail in terms of your ability to run the economy as it should be run, that you'll have that comfort zone, that safety blanket of somebody that will step in and basically pick up the pieces and save you from your predicament. And that's exactly what the IMF does. When things are going badly, it steps in to try and resolve the problem. That, according to some critics, isn't actually fixing the issue. It's basically putting a band-aid over the gaping wound, and you're not actually stopping that from happening again in the future, because no one is learning from their mistakes. If they do make a mistake as a government, a national government, you know that you always have the IMF to step in and help you out. So some people say that there shouldn't be that safety blanket, that when governments stuff up, basically, they need to learn from those mistakes. One final concern is also the lack of accountability. The IMF has become this super influential and important global institution. And some people say that they're actually too powerful, given that they don't actually have any level of accountability. You know, they make decisions to bail out a country and its economy or not, and have significant consequences for these actions. But they're not really held accountable by anyone. They don't have to answer to anyone. And a lot of people actually say that given that they are effectively an organisation of around 1,000 staff, that to be making these hugely influential decisions on the world economy, they're not even always qualified to do so. And they cite examples, for example, of support for Thai and South Korean governments months before they've ended up going into a crisis of some sort. So there are concerns also about not only their accountability, but their credibility and their expertise to actually be in a position to do what they are doing. The final institution we're going to look at today is the World Bank. And as I said, originally when it was set up, along with the IMF, was to fund Europe's reconstruction after the Second World War had concluded, and also help third world countries develop as well. Now, unfortunately for the World Bank, the first of those two aims was actually made obsolete before it had almost even started, because what the United States government did after the World Wars through its scheme that was known as the Marshall Plan was effectively directly lend money to many of the European nations to help them recover and rebuild from the Second World War. So already one of their stated aims was out the window, basically. So instead they turned towards development, and it was especially the case in a lot of these third world developing nations. That involved things like lending money, which had been raised through the sale of World Bank bonds on the international capital market. So this enabled them to help fund development for a lot of the poorer countries with regards to industries like agriculture, education, urban development, these key infrastructure related industries that help set up these poorer nations longer term. They were happy to provide loans for productive purposes in particular, so actually that would have long-term benefits for these developing nations. They provided softer loans to a lot of these less developed countries. So we're talking about things like giving them long terms over which to repay them at very low interest rates, so it was easier for those countries to do so, with some of the poorest nations even being receiving grants and interest-free, completely interest-free loans to help them develop their economies easier than some of the already more developed nations. So there was very much a promotion of private sector initiatives with this emphasis on sustainability, and also had the provision of debt and equity capital as well. So the World Bank, while perhaps not as influential as the IMF, certainly also has played and will continue to play a key role within the international monetary system.